A policeman is called by some locals to a railway bridge where underneath the arch lies the body of a prostitute. No one knew who she was and her throat was slit. A horse and cart arrives to take the body to the morgue. When he returns to the police station, Police Chief Inspector Gordon Banks asked where the corpse is. The officer's response was it got taken to the morgue, and the chief inspector denies this, saying the coroners hadn't received the body. Someone has taken the corpse of an unnamed prostitute under their noses, and where on earth has it been taken to? The doctor opens the door of the TARDIS and emerges out in Victorian garb with bowler hat. Louisa emerges out in her dress. She complained about the corset being a bit too tight but loved the dress she picked out the TARDIS wardrobe, and the doctor thinks the dress Louisa is wearing actually belonged to Victoria. They walk through the streets of Whitechapel, trying to avoid the horse and carts. They ended up in a market, filled with stalls. It was crowded and trying to get through was a little difficult. Louisa felt a bit claustrophobic amongst dozens of people, and some Londoners can be a bit snooty when being excused to move. Suddenly she felt a hand touch her skirt and sees a young pickpocket trying pinch something off her. The lad raced away and Louisa gave chase, leaving the doctor in the market. She headed through the back streets looking for the pickpocket and made a startling discovery. The young pickpocket was lying on the ground. Blood was pouring out of him and a man in his 30s was staring at her holding a hammer. He smiled, showing his rotten teeth, and started gnashing them in front of her. This freaked Louisa out and she ran out of the back street. She quickly looked back, but the man had disappeared behind her and headed to the market. Louisa tripped over due to the boots she was wearing and fell into the middle of the road. A horse and cart nearly crushed her and thankfully stopped in time. The doctor appeared from the market crowd and helped Louisa up. He then apologized to the man on the cart, and Louisa tells the doctor that she witnessed a murder involving a young pickpocket. The doctor's response was to go to the police station and report it. They arrive at the police station. The doctor tells Louisa and explains to the police what she witnessed. Chief Inspector Gordon Banks comes into the reception and Louisa explains about the murder. Chief Inspector Gordon Banks has this noted down and says they will try solve it. Then he looks at the doctor. He says to him if he's wealthy and that Louisa will keep him happy. The doctor is revolted about the thought of being sexually invested with his companion, especially when a figure of authority is telling him this. Inspector Chief Gordon Banks just stared at the doctor and lets them leave. Out on the streets, the doctor heads to the back street where the young pickpocket was murdered and finds no body, just a pool of blood. Louisa did overhear one of the officers that murders were reported but the coroners weren't receiving the bodies. The doctor thinking to himself that someone or something is stealing bodies off the streets, but he needs find evidence of this mystery. That night the doctor takes Louisa into an inn so that they can rest. As they walk in, they discover multiple men drinking heavily. Women were serving drinks and some of them were flirting, even seducing them. Louisa realizes that they entered a brothel by mistake and decide to leave. One of the ladies stops them in their tracks and asks the doctor if Louisa is seeking work. Louisa was dubious about this and the doctor respectfully says no. The lady seductively tells the doctor that he and his companion can have accommodation, but the downside is that Louisa will have to work at the brothel. Louisa brings the doctor aside and discuss the opportunity. She was quite positive about it, seeing that she's from the adult film world. She can manage the excitement of the bevy gentlemen, but the doctor sees it in a different light, and that if she performs these sexual acts amongst wealthy but sometimes dodgy men, it can lead to straight up abuse or possibly murder. Louisa had another think about and approached the lady. She accepts the offer, much to the doctor's chagrin. The next morning Louisa awoke to see the doctor looking out the window onto the streets, mumbling to himself. She jokingly says he's in Sherlock Holmes mode and the doctor just responded with a grunt sound. The lady opens the door and says to Louisa to get ready. She orders her to meet downstairs for the day's work. She then approaches the doctor still standing by the window and puts her hands on his shoulders and leans in near his face. The doctor was concerned about his companion and that bodies are disappearing around Whitechapel has put him in a desperate thinking state. The lady tries to comfort him, but he decides to prevent her sexual interactions to him and politely removes her onto a chair in the corner of the room. The lady calls herself Charlotte Pauling and tells her how she ended up in this place. She was originally married and lived a standard life, but her husband later left for the daughter of a funeral parlor named Valentine, and recently both of them went missing without a trace. The doctor, intrigued by this, decides to check this funeral parlor and see the missing bodies are related to what's going on. Charlotte meets with Louisa to discuss her job role today. Louisa will serve drinks and may perform a little dance for the punters. Louisa accepted this. An hour later, one of the customers who entered the brothel was attracted to Louisa and she realized who it was. It was the man she encountered in the back street and he was leering at her. Louisa was mortified by this and tried to escape from the bar. The man grabbed hold of her and she started to scream. The man took out a rag with chloroform on it and subdued her. The man headed to one of the back streets where a horse and cart were waiting. He loaded the subdued Louisa on the cart and placed a sheet over her. Louisa was being transported to an unknown location. The doctor heads through Whitechapel to the funeral parlor which is owned by this Valentine. He knocks on the door and a 6.5 tall gaunt man answers the door. The doctor wants to make an appointment with Mr. Valentine and the gaunt man lets him in. While waiting at the desk, the doctor starts snooping round the place, looking at paintings and was about to root through some sporadically placed documents when Mr. Valentine entered. Mr. Valentine looked ancient, like he lived for 100 years, and looked a bit deadpan when in conversation. The doctor observed his body language. He looked sinister and seemed to be hiding secrets. Mr. Valentine introduced himself as Edmund. Edmund Valentine and the gaunt man was known as casts. Edmund Valentine explains that the funeral parlor he runs is the new big thing. Instead of coffins and organized farewells, it's all about preservation. The doctor asks why. Edmund Valentine says it's for family prosperity. Keep the corpse in the house like a piece of furniture and the widowed families have the lasting remains to them for eternity. The doctor was baffled by this idea and Edmund Valentine proposes a demonstration of the preservation to him. The doctor along with Edmund Valentine entered the morgue below the building. It was massive like a warehouse and there were many wooden tables with a covered body on each of them. Edmund Valentine removed one of the sheets to reveal one of the dead bodies and the doctor from a foot away looked on. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. Her throat was slit and the skin was a light gray color. Edmund Valentine brought out a wooden cane and started whacking the corpse in various positions. The doctor cringed at this sight and even gritted his teeth in disgust. Edmund Valentine mentions he's tendering the body for the preservation and then gave it a kiss on the lips. He said it's a moment for the farewell and that's when the process will begin. Meanwhile, in another part of the funeral parlor, Louisa had awoke. She noticed she was wearing a nightgown and looked like she was in a locked room. She started banging the door and shouting for help. She suddenly thinks she's getting sold for slave labor or going to starve and suffer to death in this locked room. Then the door opened. The creepy man from earlier appeared in with chains in hand and chuckled creepily at her. Edmund Valentine instructs two of his men in funeral attire to transfer the young woman's body onto a wheelbarrow and into a copper bath. Inside the bath was a very hot wax and when the body got loaded into it they had to wait for 5 minutes. They retrieved the wax-covered corpse, placed it on a wooden board in a standing position where the feet would stick like glue and when dried it stuck in place. It didn't move or fall backwards. Edmund Valentine was pleased with the result, asked the doctor's opinions. The doctor cynically commented they should at least put clothes the body and was surprised by the process. But he did have some reservations about this, mainly why it's women and not men. Edmund Valentine skirted around the conversation, saying men live longer than women and that they are prone to more violent deaths even around Whitechapel. Then 3 more men entered the morgue carrying 3 more corpses for the preservation process. Edmund Valentine removed the sheets only to reveal Louisa. The doctor was mortified by this and accuses Edmund Valentine for killing her. Suddenly Louisa awoke abruptly and started screaming. The doctor quickly got his sonic screwdriver out and unchained her. He scolds Edmund Valentine for kidnapping. He comes to a realization that Edmund Valentine was responsible for the murders and the body snatching. Edmund Valentine reveals that he has a sexual lust for young women. He'd married countless times but wasn't happy with what he desires most and mentions that he killed his daughter Anne in response for having an affair with a married man, which turns out to be Charlotte Calling's husband. The doctor asks if Anne is here in the preservation state. Edmund Valentine's response was yes and keeps her in his master bedroom to remind himself of his own flesh and blood. Louisa butts in, says he's probably into incest and does more than look at his own preserved daughter. The doctor also asks about Charlotte's husband. Edmund Valentine's response was that he turned him into meat and fed him to dogs. The sinister man with rotten teeth called Louis approaches Edmund Valentine about his payment. Edmund Valentine shuns him about his overbearing opium addiction and tries to dismiss him in a snooty but savage way. Louis grabs hold of a hypodermic needle and points it at his face. Edmund Valentine orders his 2 men to dispose of Louis and restrain him. Louis goes insane, shouting at Edmund Valentine to die in a hole and that he wants every young woman in the world. 2 men cane Louis violently in front of the doctor and Louisa until he stopped moving. Edmund Valentine's attitude rapidly changed and confronts the doctor. Edmund Valentine wants his companion and tries to rip off Louisa's nightgown. Louisa violently shrugs him off and the doctor in a quick reaction punches him in the face, knocking him down to the floor. The doctor and his companion quickly headed to the doorway of the morgue. The door suddenly opened, revealing casts and prevented them from escaping. Edmund Valentine was assisted by his 2 men and staggeringly darted himself to the doctor. The doctor tells Louisa to scatter around the morgue and avoid being caught. The doctor teases Edmund Valentine to catch him. Edmund Valentine darted towards him and the doctor lured him to the wax preservation machine. Louisa outsmarted casts and the 2 men. She went through the doorway to the main building. The men followed suit and chased through the building. Louisa entered a hallway filled with semi-naked persevered prostitutes and tried to hide amongst them. The men entered and saw her in hiding. Louisa quickly escapes but ends up knocking the prostitutes over, and when fallen to the ground, sections of the skin broke off, exposing flesh and muscles. The doctor got up onto the machine and Edmund Valentine tried to climb up to reach the doctor, but he started to lose his grip and falls into the hot waxed bath to his death. The doctor then went straight for his companion. Just then Chief Inspector Gordon Banks and a few officers strolled in. The doctor explains that Edmund Valentine was responsible for the crime and Chief Inspector Gordon Banks says they've just arrested casts and the 2 men because some locals heard a woman's screams coming from the funeral parlor. The doctor was relieved by this and Louisa was waiting for him near the entrance still in her nightgown. The doctor and Louisa return to the TARDIS, which was suited in one of the back streets. He opens the door and Charlotte calling appeared. The doctor explains to her Edmund Valentine was responsible for murdering the prostitutes, stealing the bodies, and mentions that he turned her ex-husband into animal food. Charlotte was emotionally struck by this and tells the doctor that he could be a contender to be her next husband. The doctor kindly disagrees to the proposal and that retiring from his travels to help a widowed woman run a brothel is out of the question. Charlotte accepts the doctor's polite refusal. He says to her there's plenty fish in the sea and there's always a chance she will get lucky. Charlotte then hands him something, a brooch that her ex-husband gave to her on their wedding day, and the doctor thanks her saying he'll it keep safe. He waves goodbye to Charlotte and she tells Louisa to keep an eye on him. She thinks Louisa is important to him and that he needs company wherever he goes. Louisa accepts this and said their goodbyes to Charlotte. She watches the TARDIS dematerialize and turns round to walk the streets of Whitechapel.